we're going to combine the third and fourth tissue types into one lecture here because it's kind of a smaller class, even though we do find the majority of our body is made out of the muscles and so on. But it's kind of a simpler concept because our muscle tissue is going to be found in one of three varieties: skeletal, smooth, and cardiac. The fourth tissue type is nerve tissue. So that just takes a couple moments to go through to analyze what we're looking at and so on. Now, remember at this point, because we're almost all the way through identifying the different types of tissues, this is a classification chapter. So taking a look at what are we seeing under the microscope, what do these things look like? So to back up and review, we have epithelial tissue, which lines an opening. We find very little, if no, well, there is no matrix at all. There are no fibers and so on. It might be one cell layer to multiple cell layers thick. When we get to connective tissue, they're going to be found on the inside, connecting things together. We tend to find a lot of matrix. We start to see, in some cases, fibers and so on. Not all cases, but they fall into the categories of like bone and blood. Those are specialized connective. We also have loose connective and we have dense connective tissue. So look for those types of things in the classifications. Also think to where examples would be in the body. Now let's move forward into the muscle tissue. There's three types of muscle tissue out there, and muscle tissue is a little bit different because its job is to actually move. It's to actually contract and do physical things. So muscle tissue, we're looking at skeletal muscle in this case because I'm seeing these fibers are straight up and down, but they have little striations, things going on to the sides of those. And we'll take a look when we get to the skeletal muscle chapter. We'll look into what's actually going on with those striations and so on. But I know that skeletal muscle are those things that are found attached to bone. They are cells that are voluntarily controlled with skeletal muscle, and they are going to be kind of more rod-shaped, straight up and down, like I said, with some striations in there. Okay, so those little lines going across. Their job is to actually move. We don't see that in the microscope, so don't look for that. We're looking at describing what are we seeing. So I don't see a lot of matrix there. I'm seeing those fibers exist with striations and so on. Okay, these will have lots of nuclei along the way. That's a good example of skeletal muscle. Those would be the ones that we consciously move within our body. Now we look to the inside of our body a little bit more, lining kind of the more digestive system and so on. These are smooth muscles, and so they're going to be following lining the hollow organs. They're going to be a squeezing more motion. Now, even our esophagus has this muscle of squeezing the food down. We call that peristalsis as it goes. So lining the stomach, the intestines, the bladder, those are the muscles that are going to be there. Now, the cells themselves, we don't consciously control those. Those are involuntarily controlled. Okay, so they're going to be a little bit different in how they function. They're not quite as powerful. They're supposed to be more of a smooth and rhythmic motion, what we would see and called peristalsis. There are no striations like we saw in the skeletal muscle, and they tend to have one nucleus to them. They're more spindle shaped on the ends, like I said. Now, the last type is kind of a hybrid of that, and that we have some characteristics of smooth muscles, but also the striations and characteristics of the skeletal muscle. And this is cardiac muscle. So those are the ones, cardiac muscle, they're only found in the heart cells. They are involuntarily controlled, just like smooth muscle is, but we do find those rod-shaped cells, but they're branching off. They're not all in one straight pattern anymore. And wherever they're tied together, we will see the striations through there, but wherever they're tied together, we're going to see those dark marks, like right here, called intercalated discs. And so we see it branching, we see those striations, and every time they come together, it's almost like the hemline on your clothing, where we see, one direction being reinforced with another direction because it's constantly pulling. And so those intercalated discs tie them together. The example there again would be within the heart. Now, the last tissue type that we're going to find is going to be that of nervous tissue. Now, technically, nervous tissue has other types like glial cells. We're not going to talk about those right now. We're going to talk mostly about the cell itself, called the neuron. But glial cells are going to be the supporting surrounding tissues, okay? A lot of brain research is going into the glial research instead of the actual firing of the neuron itself. But we find nervous tissue lines all of those things, the brain, the spinal cord, and all of our other nerves. There are two types of cells. Like I said, the neuron is what we're going to be seeing in just a moment. Those are the things that are going to fire in response to the environment and pass that electrical signal on to the rest of the body or its destination. But then we have those glial cells. They're going to be more of a supporting and binding things. And so, like I said, there's a lot of research going into the actual supporting of the neurons versus the neurons themselves misfiring. So that's a much deeper topic later on in the year. But this is what we're seeing with it. It looks like a cell body here, and we see these different branches coming out of the cell cell body. And so this isn't actually matrix going around on the outside. To put it in terms of the rest of this chapter, we find glial cells supporting that. Now, let's take a look at what's actually going on. We have some specialized terms. Here's that cell body we were talking about. The nucleus is on the inside. These are things that are going to be branches coming out of the cell itself. Those are called dendrites. Those are the ones that are actually going to be receptive to whatever, is in the environment they were made for. Say this is going to be in your retina, so it's going to be responding to different wavelengths of light. Maybe this is going to be a chemoreceptor that's going to be responsible for sense of smell, or maybe this is a part of the taste bud responsible for a certain type of taste. So they're receptive to that particular type of stimulus, and then it's going to be passed along down this long cord called the axon. And you see that the axon actually isn't one thing, it actually has these branches coming off as well, so they can propagate that message and send it off and amplify it if they have to others. You'll notice that also this power cable, if you will, has a little insulator along the way. It's not consistent on there. We see these little gaps, what we call nodes of NVA, but it's those things that actually accelerate that electrical stimulus to allow that to be propagated down the nerve itself. So the dendrites are there. The nucleus is going to be the functioning part of the cell, kind of directing the traffic. And so the stimulus is going to be passed down that axon and out the rest of the nerve cell itself. Now, all of these tissues in general, if we think about, the bigger picture, where do our epithelials, our endothelials, where do all of those things come from? Well, if you think about a fertilized egg, it has one cell. And so that cell grows and divides, grows and divides, grows and divides. And so what happens is, as you sit with that ball of cells, it's going to actually start to fold in on itself as a survival technique. Otherwise, there's too many cells to get proper diffusion and nutrients and everything else. But as it folds in on itself, it actually forms 3 different layers. And so the question is, where do all of these tissues that we just talked about in the entire body, where do they all come from? It's actually, by chance, just where they end up when this ball of cells folds in on itself. See, the outer layer is called the ectoderm, and that's going to be forming, like the brain, it's going to form your skin and things like that. Now, the mesoderm I always think of as like muscle cells, okay? So that's going to be the middle part, your muscles, your connective tissue, and so on. That's going to be this inner layer of cells is going to be right here. And then there's the inner layer, okay, the endoderm. This is going to be more your digestive organs, okay, and the other interconnective tissues. That's the endoderm layer. And they've actually done experiments with this ball of cells as it goes, and takes, what if we took a piece of these cells and just put them to the inside? We translocated them, if you will. And they found that actually those cells that were on the outside, everything else became that nervous tissue, that brain and skin and all that. And the piece that they took out, because they put it down in there, that became the endoderm types of tissues. So it's actually just sheer chance where it ends up. And so it's the hormones that actually tell those cells what to do. This gives rise to the concept of stem cells. Stem cells could be like the embryological terms of it. It could be those little embryos and developing things. But we know that we have adult stem cells too. We have these cells, if you think about it, when you want to grow some more skeletal muscle, well, they've got to come from somewhere. So we get a chemical signal that, we've got to wake these cells up. We've got to grow and differentiate and create some more. So stem cells themselves are just these tissues that are treated with hormones. Sometimes we can even back program them. So it was destined to be one thing. We can turn skeletal muscle, for example, we can turn it into connective tissue, or we can take skeletal muscle and we can turn that into heart tissue. There have been cases where somebody has, a liposuction, fat is taken out, they've isolated the adult stem cells, those immature ones, they've deprogrammed them from connective tissue, they've forward programmed them into muscle tissue, and forward programmed them one more time to become cardiac, specifically cardiac muscle. So you think about it, somebody's own fat cells cured them of like a heart attack that was caused because they were fat. And that's the concept behind stem cell therapy and stem cell research, is taking these groups of cells, these tissues, and deprogramming and reprogramming them to do our jobs for them. So kind of some bigger concepts with this. When we find where did these tissues come from, think about these 3 tissue layers. Think about in terms of where they are and what they become. Think about in terms of the applications with stem cells and adult stem cells. Because, when you think about fetal stem cells, we all know that that's a controversial issue. Different sides of the scope, but actually science has progressed way beyond fetal stem cells. Now we're into adult stem cells, and the research is, how do we use our own body to cure ourselves? Everybody wins in that scenario. So taking a look at tissues, this is the kind of the end of the big pieces of all of that, and make sure you're keeping